Joint tenancy is a core concept on the national portion of the real estate exam that frequently trips up students because of its specific requirements and how it differs from other forms of co-ownership. On the exam, you need to recognize that joint tenancy is defined primarily by the right of survivorship, which is its most distinguishing and frequently tested feature. This means that if one co-owner passes away, their interest in the property does not go to their heirs, nor does it pass through the probate process. Instead, that interest automatically and immediately transfers to the surviving joint tenants. The exam will often test this by presenting a long story where 3 people own a property as joint tenants, and one owner dies, leaving a detailed will. You must remember that the remaining 2 owners now own the property equally, and the deceased person's family gets nothing, regardless of what the will says. This is a common trap, where the question tries to distract you with probate laws, but in joint tenancy, the right of survivorship supersedes any instructions in a will. To create a valid joint tenancy, the 4 unities must be present at the very beginning, when the interest is created. These are the unities of possession, interest, time, and title. You can easily remember this with the mnemonic PITT. Possession means all owners have an equal right to use the entire property, regardless of how they divided the expenses. Interest means they must hold exactly equal shares, such as 50-50 or 1/3 each. Time means all owners must acquire their interest at the exact same moment. Title means they must all be named on the very same deed or vesting document. If a test question describes a situation where one person buys into a partnership a year later than the others, or receives a separate deed, a joint tenancy cannot exist for that person because the unity of time and title are broken. The exam also focuses heavily on how joint tenancy is terminated or converted. If any of the 4 unities are broken, the joint tenancy is destroyed for that specific interest. For example, if one joint tenant sells their share to an outside party without the others, that new owner enters the relationship as a tenant in common. This happens because the new owner did not acquire their title at the same time or via the same document as the original owners. However, the original owners might still remain joint tenants relative to each other while being tenants in common with the new person. If only 2 joint tenants exist and one sells their interest to a third party, the joint tenancy is gone entirely, and the relationship becomes a standard tenancy in common. Be careful with trick wording regarding the types of entities that can own property. A corporation cannot be a joint tenant because a corporation theoretically has an infinite lifespan, and the right of survivorship would be inherently unfair and legally impossible. Therefore, a corporation can only hold title as a tenant in common, or in severalty. Another common trap involves the difference between joint tenancy and tenancy by the entirety. While both have the right of survivorship, tenancy by the entirety is reserved specifically for married couples in certain states and technically requires the 5th unity of person. Always look for the word equal when identifying joint tenancy, as unequal interests are only allowed in tenancy in common. If the exam mentions that owners have different percentages of ownership, you can immediately rule out joint tenancy as an answer choice. Remember the PITT mnemonic and the fact that joint tenancy is a last man standing type of ownership to stay focused on these requirements, and you will navigate these questions successfully.